Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. I'm Mukulika Banerjee, and in this episode, Pragya Tiwari and I will help you make sense of some extraordinary events unfolding between the governments of India and Canada. In October 2024, the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs announced the expulsion of 6 Indian diplomats, including the Indian High Commissioner, alleging India's role in the assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil and its non-cooperation in investigations. India has responded with a strong denial, insisting Canada has no evidence to show for this, and counter-expulsions have followed from India. These recent developments go back to last year, when in June 2023, the Khalistani activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot dead in his car, and the Canadian government alleged India's role in the assassination. India denied the charges and in turn accused Canada of harboring and nurturing Khalistani activists. So, as you can imagine, relations between the two countries broke down on multiple fronts, including diplomats being expelled on both sides, and India suspending visas to Canadians briefly. But in order to make sense of these more recent events, we need to know a little bit about what the Khalistan movement really is. The Khalistan movement demands a separate country for India's Sikh population and was the cause of much violence in the 1970s and 80s in India, including the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, which then in turn led to the anti-Sikh riots. It has since lost momentum in India, but it's still quite a popular cause among a section of the diaspora living in Canada and indeed in other countries. India has been calling Canada out for not taking action on Khalistanis for decades now. It should be noted that the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is reliant on the support of the National Democratic Party that is led at the moment by Jagmeet Singh, who is known to have links with Khalistani supporters. Now, while all this has been unfolding between India and Canada, there is a parallel story going on with the United States. The US have also accused Indian agents of plotting the assassination of G.S. Panun, a US national, also a Khalistani activist on US soil, and have gone ahead and arrested an alleged operative called Nikhil Gupta. And they've also named a former intelligence agent, Vikas Yadav, as an accused. India has denied Yadav is on its payrolls, but its response to the US is in stark contrast to its response to Canada. It is less defiant and it's been much more cooperative in investigations. To make further sense of this really dramatic story, Pragya Tiwari, my co-host, spoke to Suhasini Haider to understand the contours of this story better. Suhasini is one of India's foremost journalists on foreign policy and is the diplomatic affairs editor of the Hindu newspaper. She has her own podcast called The World View with Suhasini Haider. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Welcome, Suhasini, and thank you for taking the time out to talk to the India Briefing. Suhasini, you've been an observer of international relations for a very long time now. Would you say this is an unusual situation between India and Canada?
Absolutely, Pragya, and thank you for having me on the show. The truth is that we have gotten, in a sense, so used to India being defined in terms of its rivals, like Pakistan and China, the two countries that India has gone to war with, that somehow we look at those two countries as different. Our relations with them are always in a different silo from the rest of the world. The truth is there have been tensions with Canada for decades over exactly the same issue. But to have a situation today where a country that is a member of the Five Eyes, that is a G7 country, and India, which is a growing power, is looking for a world, a seat at the world table, to be in this kind of a spat over a case where, frankly, these are things that you would normally see handled backstage. Yeah. Instead, what we have seen is a very public spat between the two. I think no matter how bad the allegations or how convincing the evidence was for the Canadian Prime Minister to go on the floor of Parliament and announce that this is the investigation going on, not giving evidence, and then proceeding to expel an Indian officer, and now, of course, more has followed, is in itself quite unusual for two countries who have otherwise a lot of very strong ties, and we can talk about that later, between them. On the Indian side too, what we've seen, India sort of really going the way it hasn't with a lot of other countries. I mean, how many countries where we can say that we made them cut their High Commission strength by 2/3? In other words, out of about 60 officers, we asked 41 to leave. And this at a time when, for example, when Canada issues about 300,000 visas a year, India cut down their High Commission strength and then cancelled all Indian visas for Canadians, and even Canadians are about 277,000 visas that India gives to Canadians every year, and they cancel them for about a month. So you're seeing this as a very, very strong kind of response from both sides. I think above all, what does surprise is the kind of personal allegations that have run between the two. I mean, essentially, at the highest levels, these two countries are accusing each other of murder and extortion and of using domestic politics or making domestic politics the reason for destroying international relations.
We'll come to domestic politics in a second, Suhasini, but like you said, to those of us on the outside, this seems to have escalated pretty quickly. What might be some key errors of judgment or overreach that you see were made on both sides?
I mean, I keep trying to unravel just what happened at this time last year, because going into May of 2023, India was more or less on top of the world. It was the host of the G20. The entire global leadership was about to visit in September of that year. Prime Minister Modi was about to embark on a very important visit to the US, a red carpet really for him, a state visit for him, his first. There were so many different agreements that were going to take place. On the India-Canada front, at the same time, things had gotten a little better. They had been tense previously, but there'd been one meeting between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Modi in Germany the year before that, and it seemed as if things were limping along back. We'd seen many ministerial visits to Delhi. We'd seen, in fact, Canada had announced an Indo-Pacific policy, and India had a role in that. So you were seeing a kind of, a very good position at that time. Now, this is when the alleged plot into a targeting of a US-based Khalistani activist, that is Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, is supposed to have begun. And at the same time, the plotting for the killing of the Canadian Khalistani activist Hardeep Nijjar was already underway. And those two cases have blown up so much that it becomes a little difficult now in that whole debris of the, explosion, if you like, to tell who made the first error of judgment or who made the second one. I think on the Indian side, our officials are certainly, guilty of not taking the allegations seriously enough. In other words, the response to the allegations was more or less mocking and laughing in the face of the Canadian government, so that when their officials came to Delhi and tried to explain the details of the evidence they had, and clearly, that evidence, we still don't know what it was, it wasn't taken seriously enough. And then when Mr. Trudeau came for the G20 in September, again, I think there was an error on a diplomat's part not to see how far this was going. And this means both diplomats in Canada and the diplomats over here, that they just did not see how serious this was becoming. On the Canadian side, I think the errors of judgment are very clear for a prime minister to have spoken the way he has. And even today, Prime Minister Modi has not spoken in that way. And the fact that Mr. Trudeau put out, allegations which were not backed up with any publicly available evidence. I mean, most of the publicly available evidence that we have is either through leaks to news agencies or what the US is saying in its charge sheet about the targeting of Pannur. We're not yet seeing that evidence, and without that evidence, to have taken these steps has shocked so many in India. And I think there is a sense that there's an unnecessary amount of public posturing rather than working behind the scenes. Because if the idea is just to blow relations out of the water, then go ahead. But if the idea is to try and look for, threads to an investigation and then hold people to account and all the rest of that, then you don't move in this direction. I think once the expulsions happened, and for India, the expulsion in Canada was really public because this was the station head. These are open positions for intelligence agents. And for them to have named the intelligence agent really put a target on his back in a sense before sending him back. I think Canada erred over there as well. I think the Indian response, which was more or less to say, we will have nothing to do with you, at the same time as saying, we deny any wrongdoing. So if you deny any wrongdoing, then, to be escalating the issue like this also seemed like an error to me, to be expelling their diplomats or telling them to leave or that you would not be responsible for their diplomatic immunity, also cancelling the visa systems. And all the rest, the fallout, as it were, of the international stage is an error of judgment, particularly when you look at what's happening in the rest of the world. Things are blowing up in other places too. And this India-Canada spat seems to have unnecessarily occupied so much space for both countries.
Absolutely. And so, Asni, perhaps the elephant in the room is domestic politics on both sides. Could you talk a little bit about how domestic politics has played into what's going on and what's been developing between these two countries?
This is why I feel that the error of judgment lies with the diplomats on both sides not seeing how this is coming. Because this was not, the tensions between the two countries were really very much about domestic politics. On the Canadian side, I think if you remember, Mr. Trudeau came to power and one of his first statements was, I now have more minorities of Indian origin in my cabinet than Mr. Modi does. Obviously, that's a sore point because Mr. Modi does have very, very few minorities in his cabinet. But to have made that statement, even in jest, found its mark. Subsequently, what we saw, certainly the Canadian side doing, it seemed, was playing to those Indian origin communities inside Canada, particularly the Sikh community, and perhaps the most extremist wing of that Sikh community, because Mr. Trudeau was worried about, the liberal support amongst those communities. And over the next few years, we saw more and more, if you like, separatist Khalistani groups coming to the fore in Canada. More of these, tableaus which showed the killing of Indira Gandhi, glorified that, pictures of Mr. Modi behind bars. These kind of events sort of took on a lot more prominence than we had seen in previous years because of this kind of liberal government support, or if you like, a desire to pander to that community. So this was a domestic thing which was causing a lot of heartburn in India, clearly. And this goes without saying that Canada believes that its freedom of expression laws allow people to carry out these kind of processions. But then they should not be surprised when the reaction to those are as strong as they are in India, because we have a right to have a reaction as well. The second part, which is the Indian side, I think may have been becoming more and more tense, even though Prime Minister Modi had gone to Canada in 2015. And, it's interesting, one should remember that for 40 years, from 1973 to 2015, no Indian Prime Minister visited Canada for a bilateral visit. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh went for a G20. And even when he went, before he went to Canada, there was a lot of work done by the Canadian government at the time. Stephen Harper actually holding a memorial and apologizing to the families of the victims of the Kanishka bombing. and a park was named in their honor, and a kind of, a mea culpa, more or less, that the government had not done enough investigation into the case, was issued in the form of a commission of inquiry. So this is ancient history. This is 2009, 2010 I'm talking about. But that's when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh went there. Prime Minister Modi was the first leader to go in 42 years for a bilateral visit to Canada. And that should tell you just the fact that the relations were always tenuous. They were always very, very tense and needed to be dealt with very, very, in a way, very, very carefully, rather than in this open diplomacy kind of way, and open, because we've seen the impact of coming out in the open about all of these misgivings about each other, if you like. To come back to what we saw India doing in terms of the domestic politics, I think the turning point was the Citizenship Amendment protest, a Citizenship Amendment Act protest, and suddenly we saw the diaspora around the world actually gathering and beginning to protest against the Indian government. And, till then, for the Modi government, he had been carrying out these big diaspora events around the world. And it really looked like the entire Indian diaspora was rooting for him. And suddenly you saw these protests coming out on the CA to begin with, where a lot of these possibly, what they call disgruntled elements in the Sikh community as well. But of course, some separatist Khalistani groups as well. And I think we have to be careful to remember not everybody is part of the Khalistani movement if you're a non-resident from a certain community. But we started to see them coming out to protest against the Modi government. And then, of course, what followed was the farmers' protests. The way they were handled in India, certainly the government took a really tough stand against the protesters, more or less tried to freeze them out. After that, there was a lot of lathi charge. I think 700 to 800 farmers eventually died during those protests. We also saw the government calling all these protesters terrorists, talking about the Khalistani element inside those protests, really otherizing those protesters. And then that had an impact internationally. If you remember, Justin Trudeau came out and protested about the way India was dealing with its protests. Again, a gross overreach into India's affairs. But at the end of the day, the Indian government's reaction, in a sense, was really about the domestic. How dare somebody challenge us internationally, was really pitched to their domestic crowd. And then the reactions kind of, they snowballed. So I do think domestic politics was a big part of it. Punjab elections followed well, the Canadian elections followed in Canada. And we saw Justin Trudeau come back with a very thin sliver of a majority. We saw Mr. Modi's government, or the BJP, not win in Punjab either. And so that hasn't helped either in terms of making them make their sort of point with the other side, if you like. As I said, things were actually getting better by 2022. But obviously, what we've seen over the past year makes it look like it'll be very hard to go back to that.
Now, there's a related story, like you mentioned earlier, that's been developing in the US. Even before the killing of Nijjar, there was an investigation in the US, and there was an allegation that India might be involved in plotting the killing of Panun, who was a Khalistani activist. How has India's response to the allegations that have come from the US differed from India's response to Canada, and why do you think that is?
Pragya, to begin with, we have to look at India's response to a number of these cases now. I mean, in the last few years, what we have seen, Indian intelligence officials have been accused of overreach by a number of countries. So if in Canada, they are actually accused of carrying out the assassination of somebody who was a Canadian citizen, and in the US, they're accused of targeting at least one American citizen. But if you look at the transcripts, they're talking about 2 to 3 hit jobs a month allegedly being planned, one in New York, one in California, and more to follow. In Australia, Indian intelligence agents were accused of what was called the Nest of Spies case, where essentially they were accused by the Australian Secret Service of targeting the diaspora and keeping a tab and surveilling Australian citizens of Indian origin. And, that sort of thing. In Germany, I think there was a similar case, but then that was dealt with in the courts. With the UK, there was the other case that we had, which was, the targeting of the Indian High Commission, and that followed with a lot of reciprocal acts between the two countries before they both decided to calm down. Then you look away from that to the other things that Indian intelligence agencies have been accused of. There is the UAE princess case, if you like, of Princess Latifa that played out in a UK court that held India responsible for the kidnapping of the princess and return to her family that she was trying to get away from. You had the Qatari case where you had 8 Indians, former naval officers, being charged, accused, and then convicted and sentenced to death for allegedly spying. Eventually, those charges they were let off on those charges. One of those officers, the most senior, is still in Qatar in custody. So you've got a number of these allegations, and not the least, of course, the Pakistan allegations. Now, when it comes to the Pakistan allegations, which is that India targeted Pakistani citizens and killed them, it was almost seen as a badge of honor in India. We've had leaders of the country go to public rallies and say, in other words, we have shown that we will go inside people's homes and kill them if they threaten us. Right? So over there's a kind of almost, sort of proud acceptance that India carries out these operations. In all these other cases, of course, we've seen denials. And some of them, they've just been ignored. I think the Australian cases were just, India said nothing at all. And those officials were deported back to India. Now you look at the two, America and Canada cases. And essentially, one flows from the other in the sense that it is the US case, I think, that originally carried out the investigation, because that investigation, the surveillance, the fact that an Indian official, whom we now know has been identified as Vikas Yadav, got in touch with a middleman, asked him to then organize a hit. That middleman appears to have really made a mistake in reaching out to an informant of the US Department, Drugs Enforcement Agency, the DEA. That when a particular person he got in touch with, who's called the CS, the confidential source in the affidavit, then got in touch with the FBI, and an FBI undercover officer became the alleged hitman for this case. On one hand, you would say that, the US really set up a trap for the Indian official because they go along with him, pretending to be ready to carry out this attack and, recording him all along, and I think hacking his own phone and getting his details of whom he spoke to as well, which they have put into their indictment, which was unsealed in November, and now there's a second indictment against Yadav that just came out this month. And in that, they made it clear that the Indian official was talking not just about the American cases, he was also talking about the possibility of carrying out these kind of hits in Canada. India will have to at some point explain how far up the chain this went, or whether it went or not, whether they are able to say that Mr. Yadav was just a rogue officer working on his own and they had nothing to do with it, or whether they actually do see some larger conspiracy within India's intelligence agencies or otherwise. That really remains to be seen. But this is what the US indictment is right now saying, that the Canadian plot was also discussed. It's another matter that eventually they say, well, we found somebody else to do the Canadian hit, and then shared pictures of the Nijjar killing with the Americans. But the truth is that there is a link being established by the US itself. Even so, India's response to the US has been straight away. As soon as those allegations came, and the indictment came, more importantly, in November last year, India announced the setting up of a high-level panel of investigators. We understand now that they are led by the Deputy National Security Advisor. They've even now gone to the US. They've furnished certain information about Mr. Yadav, I think reportedly saying that he no longer works for us. He was briefly arrested, I think, but then got bail in the case. And there's every aspect of India's reaction to that has been, cooperating with what the US has asked for and what the US's allegations are, even though India does not accept those allegations. But with Canada, it's been very different. It's played out in the public, I think, owing to the fact that Mr. Trudeau went public first. But India's response has been successively saying, we have nothing to do with this. There is not a shred of evidence that the allegations are purely a fictional, a figment of the Canadian imagination that is being done for domestic political reasons. So it's chalk and cheese, the attitude towards the US and Canada. There are not just two neighbors. They work together on intelligence in particular in the Five Eyes network. And we've sort of so far seen in the Indian government really continuing that posture with both those countries. So it's a very different posture that they've adopted towards the other two. But as I said, after a point, the questions are rising about exactly how much was the Indian intelligence agencies allowed to carry out this kind of, extra territorial operations, if you like.
Right, and that's the operative part. We're still far away from answers. We don't know whether what really happened, what went on, who knew, who was responsible, and so on. But so far, we've been talking about how this has been playing out on the world stage. Domestically, for us, I'm wondering if you think this opens up perhaps long-standing questions about our intelligence agencies, their sort of structural framework, their competence levels, their accountability, and so on, because these are very serious allegations. And if just for ourselves, for the sake of our national security, they should be looked into quite seriously.
Pragya, I think that's actually the crux of the matter for Indians. Whether Indian intelligence agencies were involved in extrajudicial, extraterritorial operations abroad, whether it was in the US or Canada or other countries, frankly, it's not as if India would be the only country carrying those out.
Absolutely.
I think everybody can see right now in the last month, Israel openly claiming credit for carrying out operations that don't just target one person. They're killing thousands of people in order to target one operative that they believe is being sheltered over there. And saying it quite honestly, and in various other countries, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, Iraq, and all the rest. So I don't think that for most Indians, when they look at this case, they go, oh my God, is India going to be the first? But we do need to respect the fact that this is the first time an Indian official, an Indian intelligence official, a paramilitary official, whether or not he works for them anymore, is on the FBI's most wanted list. This has not happened before. And it does raise questions about whether there is a shift in the way our intelligence agencies were working the last few years that needs to have a spotlight put on it. We also need to understand, because, of course, that the Indian external intelligence agencies don't actually exist as an institution. They don't have oversight from Parliament. They don't have been created by an act, and they function under the Cabinet Secretariat of India. So in other words, there is no one but the Prime Minister's office, in a sense, that oversees them, whether it's through the National Security Council and the NSC Secretariat or the Prime Minister's office itself. And I think that is something that many have been now saying we need to look more closely at. Where is the accountability for these officials if they are carrying out attacks externally and targeting basically people of Indian origin or even Indians? Then we do, as Indian citizens, need to know exactly what are the orders against them. What is the threshold of evidence that they need to find before they go out and carry out these attacks? We know that in many of these, like Nijjar and Panun, are on India's UAPA list. But do they need to go through a court process over here before they're being targeted in this way? So that's one part of the question. I think also is this question, Pragya, which the government has not really answered. Which is it? Are you saying that we carry out these attacks, or are you saying we have nothing to do with the attacks? If India's policy is that we don't carry out extrajudicial, extraterritorial killings, like other countries do, then we need to find out how this happened, how many people knew, how many people were involved, why this happened at all. And if, on the other hand, that is our policy, then it is a huge shift in policy. They need to talk. So this question of complicity versus incompetence, I think that is also a key part of the questions we're asking. And I completely agree with you that those are answers we need as Indian citizens. In terms of, what's happening internationally, frankly, the international rule of law is right now being strained by absolutely every big player in the world. So I don't think that is as much primacy for Indians, but I think the idea of who is overseeing our intelligence agents and what kind of licenses they're being given, I think that certainly is very important for us.
Suhasini, how do you see this playing out, domestically and perhaps globally? A lot of people have referred to this as India's century, where on one hand talking about us being a major economic power, soft power, and so on. And on the other hand, we have this friction with Canada, which of course we've not managed to isolate Canada in this scenario. The response of other global powers has been to rally behind Canada to some extent or the other. What do you see as the potential ramifications for India in this context?
First is obviously India's image. I can't stress this enough, and I say this maybe more as somebody who watches India's diplomacy, that India's image in the world, the goodwill that India has generated, comes from the idea that it is essentially a power that spreads the softer side of diplomacy around the world. India is known for its culture, it's known for its pluralism, it's known for its yoga, for essentially not being a country that aggresses on other countries, even when it is aggressed itself. That kind of image is going away. Maybe that is part of India's fate. So when you say what happened in the future, maybe India's image now in the world will be a little different. It will be a little closer to the Chinas, the Irans, the Israels, the Russias, and of course, all Western countries that do carry out these kind of attempts. I think the first is about where is India's image going with all of this. I think the second is essentially a kind of look at what will happen in terms of diplomatic ties and then extrapolating from them. With the US, what we have seen is the US is not essentially doing more than talking about this case. It's not changing the way it does business with India, at least publicly. Internally, we do understand that now there's a Transnational Repression Act in the Congress. It's going to make it a little more difficult for bilateral conversations, perhaps maybe a little awkward, like we've seen even with the National Security Advisor, Mr. Doval, suddenly not going to the US with the Prime Minister. It's not as if he would ever have been summoned in the US, but it just makes conversations awkward. Second is, I think, in terms of, with the US, is in terms of intelligence cooperation. Will the US, and actually these Five Eye countries that used to share a lot of information with India when it came to diaspora groups inimical to India, and, kept an eye on them, if you like. Will they continue to share that intelligence if they feel that India is now targeting them and using their information to do that? And I think the third place where we'll have to see what kind of cooperation there is between the Department of Justice that is prosecuting these cases. That's one part of where we see it. With Canada, of course, if this continues where we have whittled down our staff strengths and diplomat strengths in both countries, what's the next thing that's going to be affected? Obviously, visas on both sides. And I said roughly about 300,000 visas being issued normally on both sides. If visas are cut, obviously Indian students will suffer, Canadian and Indian businessmen will suffer, and we will see possibly even travel links being cut down because then, there aren't so many people going back and forth. So those kind of in the short term is what I'm seeing as the impact. I think in the long term, we will be able to ride this out no matter what, because, eventually these are cases in a court. Governments will come and governments will go. Mr. Trudeau may not be Prime Minister after next year's election. Mr. Biden is not going to be president as of 2 weeks from now. Then we have to see whether the next government in these countries takes the same attitude and gives the cases the same primacy. Even though the judicial system will continue, the question is how much will bilateral relations be affected by it. So I think in the long term, India will ride out the storm. But I think those who felt a year ago that this is nothing, that this is just going to go away, have learned a year later that the process continues and is liable to come back and make things awkward and embarrassing for India at any given point when evidence is revealed. So I think we must be very cautious in the short term, at least.
Process continues. Final question, Suhasini. You'll be watching this story. It is a developing story. What might be some of the key developments for people who are listening to this to look out for to try and make sense of how it shapes up in the near future?
Okay, so one of the questions, Pragya, that I often get, particularly in India, is if Canada has any evidence, why doesn't it show it? And I think that's because the way the Canadian processes go, they don't have this unsealed indictment kind of that the US does. I think we have to wait for that Canadian trial to really get underway to see what they have. So I think that'll be one big development to watch for. The second is, of course, the US trial as well, which has been put off. I think Mr. Gupta was brought the courts and, the case was adjourned for a month or two, but it will start fairly soon. So what happens in the US case? Because whatever is entered in as evidence in the US case will probably be used in the Canadian courts as well. As I said, these elections are going to willy-nilly be a big development to watch for, because to see whether successive governments take these issues as seriously. As I said, nobody is denying that there is a double standard here. That Western countries almost applaud these kind of operations by some of their allies. So the outrage over India doing this is rather a double standard. But what one has to remember is that those operations are normally not carried out in friendly countries. So that's the basic difference between the two. So I think that's what we have to watch, is how do future governments in these countries take it. And finally, I think we really do need to see the government working closely with all the Five Eyes countries, realizing now, and I think we've seen it now with the kind of coordinated statements that come out from them, supporting Canada or supporting the US or telling India, you must investigate, you must cooperate. The way they coordinate, I think it should be very obvious to us that we need to work with each of these countries. They're all close partners of India. And we need to maybe just reassure them about any misgivings they may have.
Always so enlightening talking to you. Thank you once again, Suhasini, for taking the time out to do this. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pragya.
So that was Suhasini Haider in conversation with my colleague Pragya Tiwari. We will continue to follow this developing story and many more on the India Briefing. Please don't forget to rate the show, share it and subscribe. You can also write to us on tib@oijo.in with your thoughts and suggestions. See you again soon. Goodbye.